There are games that come out and people say they changed everything. Most of the time, that's just marketing noise. But every once in a while, a game actually does change the conversation about what this medium can be, and nobody fully realizes it until years later. God of War Ragnarok is one of those games. Released in November 2022, it was the follow-up to one of the most celebrated reboots in gaming history, and somehow it managed to not just match the original, but actually exceed it in almost every measurable way. The question worth asking in 2026 is not whether it was good back then. The question is whether it still holds up as one of the best games ever made, or whether time has revealed cracks that the hype originally covered up. Let's start with the combat, because that is the engine that drives everything in this game. Kratos moves with this weight and deliberate power that very few games have managed to replicate since. Every axe throw, every shield bash, every punch feels connected to something physical. The Leviathan axe returns from the 2018 game and it still feels incredible to use, but Ragnarok expands the combat toolkit significantly. The Blades of Chaos are back from the beginning this time rather than being held back as a mid-game reveal, and the way the game lets you seamlessly switch between the two weapons in the middle of combat chains creates a flow that takes real skill to master. There is a surface level of combat that carries you through the main story without much effort, but underneath that surface is a surprisingly deep system of runic attacks, shield parries, stances, and elemental interactions that rewards players who invest time learning it. Most modern action games give you tools and forget to give you reasons to use them creatively. Ragnarok actually incentivizes experimentation in a way that feels rewarding rather than obligatory. Atreus as a playable character represents something worth discussing because the reception to those sections was genuinely divided at launch. Playing as a teenage boy after spending time as one of the most powerful beings in mythology felt like a downgrade to some people. But looking back honestly, those sections serve a critical narrative purpose, and the combat during Atreus segments, while clearly lighter, has its own satisfying rhythm. Understanding why Santa Monica Studio made that creative choice requires looking at the story they were trying to tell, and that story is where this game does something genuinely special. The narrative in Ragnarok is operating on multiple layers simultaneously. On the surface, it is a war story about gods and prophecy and the end of the world. But underneath that, it is a story about a father realizing his son no longer needs to be protected, but needs to be trusted. Kratos spent the entire 2018 game learning how to be present as a father. Ragnarok asks the harder question of whether he can actually let go. The writing handles this with a maturity and restraint that blockbuster games rarely attempt. Moments of emotional weight are earned through context and character development rather than manufactured drama. There is a scene involving Kratos and a character named Brock that genuinely surprised people who had played games for decades and thought they were past being emotionally affected by them. No spoilers, but the game earns that moment completely. The character work extends well beyond the main duo. Freya's arc from enemy to reluctant ally to something more complex is handled with real nuance. Mimir remains one of the most entertaining exposition delivery systems in gaming history, managing to make lore drops feel like conversation rather than lectures. The new characters introduced across the 9 realms each carry their own weight. Angrboda, Thor, Odin, and Tyr are all written with dimensions that make them feel like actual beings with histories and motivations rather than plot devices wearing costumes. Thor in particular is a fascinating subversion of expectations that rewards players who pay attention to what the game is quietly showing them about his character beneath all that bluster. The world design across the 9 realms is where the game's ambition becomes undeniable. Each realm has its own visual identity, its own environmental hazards, its own aesthetic logic. Svartalfheim with its industrial waterways and dwarven engineering feels completely distinct from the crystalline geometry of Alfheim or the volcanic brutality of Muspelheim. Exploration is rewarded constantly, not just with gear, but with story context, hidden conversations, environmental details that flesh out the mythology. The side content in Ragnarok is worth mentioning specifically because it never feels like potting. The favor quests, which is the game's term for side missions, actually contribute meaningfully to character relationships and world building. Completing them changes how certain characters talk to you and what they say, which gives optional content actual narrative weight. The RPG progression system handles gear, skills, and upgrades in a way that feels substantial without overwhelming. You are constantly finding materials and making choices about where to invest your resources. Different builds genuinely change how combat feels, rewarding players who want to engage deeply with the system while not punishing those who just want a fun experience without overthinking gear optimization. The game is generous with difficulty options too, making it accessible to players who care mainly about the story, while offering enough challenge ceiling to satisfy veterans who want every fight to demand their full attention. Now, looking at this from a 2026 perspective, how does Ragnarok actually hold up visually and technically? The honest answer is remarkably well. The art direction was always more important than raw graphical specs here, and good art direction ages far better than technical showmanship. The character model quality, the environmental detail, the lighting in indoor spaces, it all still looks genuinely impressive. What has aged slightly is some of the facial animation and background characters during cutscenes, which occasionally dips below the extraordinarily high standards set by the main cast. Running on current hardware eliminates the load time considerations that were part of the original conversation, and the game has been stable and polished since launch in a way that many releases from that era were not. The music, composed by Bear McCreary, is one of those scores that embeds itself in your memory permanently. The main theme carries this aching weight that matches the tone of the story perfectly. Combat music escalates in ways that feel dynamic rather than repetitive. The sound design overall is exceptional, from the crack of the Leviathan axe embedding in a frozen enemy to the ambient wind across the frozen plains of Midgard. Christopher Judge's performance as Kratos remains one of the most impressive voice acting achievements in the medium. He does more with silence and breath and subtle shifts in tone than most actors do with full monologues. The weaknesses in Ragnarok are real but minor in the context of everything the game delivers. The pacing in the middle section sags in a few places where the journey between major story beats stretches longer than it needs to. Some of the realm content, particularly late in the game, feels slightly rushed compared to the more carefully developed early sections. And while the ending satisfies emotionally, some players felt the final confrontation with the central antagonist resolved certain threads too cleanly given the complexity of what preceded it. None of those criticisms diminish what this game is in the larger picture. God of War Ragnarok sits comfortably at a 4.8 out of 5 for me. The missing fraction is not a flaw so much as an acknowledgement that even great things have room to breathe. This game delivers one of the most complete and emotionally resonant experiences the medium has produced. The combat, the story, the characters, the world, the audio, all of it works together at a level of craft that still commands respect in 2026, when the conversation around what games can achieve has moved considerably forward from where it was in 2022. If you have never played this game, the fact that you are watching this review in 2026 is actually a gift. You get to experience it in its final complete form with all the post-launch content included, on hardware that runs it flawlessly, without the spoiler minefield that surrounded it at launch. That is honestly the best possible way to play something like this. If this gave you something to think about or brought back some feelings about a game you love, hit that like button because it genuinely helps. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one covering games that deserve to still be talked about. Share this with someone who hasn't played Ragnarok yet and needs a push. And drop a comment telling me which moment in the game hit you the hardest. I already know what mine was, but I want to hear yours.